All right, I'm here with Adrienne Lucas of University of Delaware. Um, Adrienne, you've done a lot of work in education, um, and I think a lot of work that that are interested in reforming education systems would be interested in. I want to talk to you about one specific paper that I know you're still working on, that's titled "The Successful Interventions at Scale: The Importance of Managers," that you're doing jointly with Serene Begg and Anne Fitzpatrick. Um, it seems obvious from the title, but I'll just kind of ask you this question anyways, in case there's more nuance you want to add to it. But what was the kind of research question that you were trying to answer when you guys started this project?
Yeah, so we were really thinking about what is the importance of school leaders, school managers in student achievement.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're interested in this really for two reasons. And one of them is because I think we don't really know the effect of school management on student outcomes. And secondly, as we think about the mounting evidence on how to improve student learning, we need to think about that, embedding that in existing systems and taking it to scale. And any attempt to take that at scale is going to involve existing school leaders. Mm-hmm. And so that's where we really kind of came from in thinking about this question.
Got it. And so if you could just talk a little bit about how you went about answering this question. I know that this work took place in Ghana, so if you could just kind of give us some context on that.
Yeah, so we ended up thinking about kind of a couple different interventions at the same time. So in the first one, we're going to think about training teachers. And in the second one, we thought about training teachers as well as the school leaders. And as you said, this is in Ghana. And so in the Ghanaian context, they're called head teachers, but they're not classroom teachers. So I know that's kind of different in different contexts. So I was thinking about a school principal, school leader, they're just called head teachers. And then the third person that we're going to be interested in thinking about is someone called a circuit supervisor. And the circuit supervisor is someone who's a liaison between the school leader and the district education office. So the circuit supervisor is responsible for about 10 geographically proximate schools. And so from the beginning, we really wanted this to be embedded in existing systems because part of our interest in this is thinking about how to scale effective solutions. And so we collaborated with the Ministry of Education and UNICEF. And they were really interested in a very specific pedagogy program. And the specific teacher training or pedagogy program they were interested in was what's called targeted instruction. And so what targeted instruction does is for part of each school day, teachers teach at the learning level of the student instead of the grade level of the student. And so that's where we kind of the starting point from that. And so from there, we implemented a randomized control trial. As you said, this is going to be in Ghana. And we're going to do this across 210 schools in 20 districts in Ghana. And we're going to focus on upper primary, which is grades 4 through 6. And the nice thing about a randomized control trial is that we're going to randomize the treatment. So at the end of the intervention, we can say, if we find any differences between our different treatments, we know it's because of the intervention and not because of something else that just happened or is by coincidence, is similar or different across these schools. So in our randomized control trial, we have 3 separate arms or 3 separate interventions. The first intervention is training teachers in targeted instruction. In addition to training teachers in targeted instruction, we provided head teachers and circuit supervisors with a form that they could fill out when they were doing a teacher classroom observation. And this form hit the highlights of targeted instruction. Are students divided by learning levels? Is active pedagogy going on? Are teaching and learning materials being used effectively? So the things you would think of in terms of kind of the highlights of targeted instruction. And then because the ministry was so interested in this, they wanted to see this in practice on the ground, which meant that they sent national monitoring teams. The idea was to visit every school about once a term and just kind of see how this was working in practice. In reality, they don't get to every school every term, but they get to about 80% of schools every term, and every school is visited at least once. So that's the first intervention. In the second intervention, we did the same thing, plus the school leaders, so the head teachers, as well as the circuit supervisors received additional management training on how to support teachers, how to be more effective leaders, how to run a more efficient school, these types of issues. And then in the third arm is the control. So to summarize, we have 210 schools. For each school, we randomly allocated either to teacher training plus head teacher plus circuit supervisor training, or control business as usual. And so that's how we went about evaluating the program.
Fascinating. And can you give us a sense of the timeline? So when this happened and kind of where relative to where we are now?
Yes. So this happened in the previous school year.
I
So
see.
we actually surveyed. So we're going to survey head teachers, circuit supervisors, teachers, and students. We surveyed them at the end of not this past school year, but the previous school year.
Mm,
And Ghana is on an approximately US school calendar. So it's kind of
okay.
September to June, approximately.
Hmm.
So we would have surveyed these students 2 Junes ago.
Mm,
And then in the summer holidays, that was when the trainings occurred. And so then the intervention kind of baked, or the targeted instruction happened or didn't, depending on the intervention arm, for
right.
all of the prior school year. Or I guess we're now, sorry, I feel like we're still in the 1920 school year. So this is all
Right.
talking about the 1819. So this is all in the
Got it.
1819 school
Got
year.
it. Got it.
So in
Okay.
the 1819 school year, and at the end of 19, we did some surveys and student assessments. Then in the 1920 school year, schools were actually instructed. And we were then going to go back, and we were actually in the middle of a follow-up survey when we had to stop field activities.
I see.
So we do have some limited data, and the limited data we have is that schools are at, well, we're cutting to the chase. We haven't talked about the results yet,
Right.
but we don't have student achievement for the second round, but we do have some evidence that teachers are continuing to implement the program.
Got it. So your second year would have ended in June
Yes,
2020.
would be ending
Got it.
like now, yeah, or
Got it.
a month
Got it.
ago, yeah.
Got it. Okay. So if you could, you were just about to get into that, but if you could get into kind of what the key findings have
Yeah.
been so far from what you guys have seen.
Yeah, so this is going to be based on the end of that first academic year.
Right.
And so based on the end of the first academic year, we have 3 big findings. One, teachers did this. And you might think, of course they did this. But honestly, going into this, it wasn't really obvious teachers were going to do this.
Right.
So I have previous work with Annie Duflo and Jessica Kissel in which teachers didn't really do this. So there wasn't even that checklist at the classroom level. There was certainly no national level monitoring, and teachers didn't do it. And evidence from Banerjee and co-authors in India, when they put a similar program in the field without supervision, the teachers didn't do it in India either. So the fact that teachers did it is actually a pretty cool finding. And the second thing is that student achievement increased. So student achievement increased by about 11% of a standard deviation. And to put that into something maybe more meaningful, that's about a third of a school year. So Ghana has a 3-term school year. So it's like students got almost an extra term of learning through this program. And then the third important finding is the first 2 findings are the same across the 2 treatment arms. So the management and no management arms have the same effects on these first 2 outcomes. And so what we're really spending a lot of time doing now is trying to understand the why. So if you were to come back to me in about 2 months, optimistically, maybe 3, we'd have a lot more to say about why. But so far, our why is a couple of things. So other things that are the same across the 2 arms is that in both arms, head teachers and circuit supervisors increase the likelihood that they performed a classroom observation lasting at least 30 minutes. This is the same across the 2 treatment arms and very much increased relative to the control arm.
Can you, sorry to interrupt, can you just say a little bit more about, can you kind of quantify that increase?
I could quantify that increase, but honestly, I have to look it up.
Okay, fair enough. No, that's fine. Yeah. Okay.
So I can follow up with you with that, with the exact number, but it's much more likely. And then I'm trying to think if I can look that up on the fly quickly. And then the other thing is that teachers are more likely to say that these are useful observations. And so it looks like the difference between, so it looks like head teachers are about 25 percentage points more likely to do a classroom observation of more than 30 minutes. What we found is that if you ask teachers, do head teachers observe your classrooms? Almost every teacher says yes. And then we kind of started in some of the early data rounds. We said, well, how long do they spend? And teachers were saying like, oh, they spend 5 minutes. But okay, this is not what we're looking for, right? We would not consider that actually a meaningful classroom observation. So we kind of made this cut at 30 minutes and found that the differences are pretty stark relative to the control group. And then looks like about 10 to 15 percentage points more likely to say the feedback was useful.
Got it.
So they're performing more classroom observations, and teachers are more likely to say that the feedback is useful.
Got it. Okay.
I'm sorry, and the second thing we think is going on here is you think this national level monitoring was also potentially very important.
Mm-hmm.
So across both treatment schools, about 80% of schools were visited each term. And we think this did a couple things. We think this sent a really strong signal that this is a serious program. This is a Ministry of Education program. This is not just some arbitrary thing that we're going to tell you to do today and tomorrow we're going to change our minds. And we also think it put additional pressure at the district education officer level. So the way the national monitors work, they would go to the district education office, they would kind of pick up people from the district education office, and they would all go together to the schools. And so there was additional pressure and additional monitoring from the district level.
Got it. Okay, interesting. So as you know, GSL and our partners, we're all focused on training school leaders. So I'm curious to hear what you think the implications of this finding would be for organizations like GSL and others that are working on training school leaders or working with school leaders.
Yeah, I think this is the first time we've seen in management, and we've seen it in other places, is thinking about discrete tasks versus amorphous be better. So I think there's evidence if we think about students improving their test scores, improve your test scores, and students don't really know how to do it. But if we say, read 5 books, that's something that's very task-based.
Right.
I think that's something we're seeing here, is that when we told head teachers and circuit supervisors, here is a form, you can sit in a classroom, you can fill it out, you can give teachers feedback based on this form, they all seem to do it. And we think that's probably one of the ways in which the student outcomes improved. Whereas the management training, I think maybe wasn't concrete enough. It was here's how you make a school better, but it wasn't necessarily these very discrete tasks. So I think that's one thing to think about. And I don't want people to look at our study and say, oh, your study says management doesn't matter. I don't think it says that at all. I think it just says that, we need to think very carefully about how we engage managers and think about what's the most important thing that's going to translate into student learning.
Got it. Can I ask you, in terms of even getting the school leaders in the treatment where they didn't have the training, their kind of leadership focused training to do the classroom observations and the data collection. You mentioned earlier that, this was a program that the national government was taking seriously. So there was kind of some of that. Can you say anything more about how even the school leaders that weren't getting the training, like what got them to get into the classrooms and do the observations?
Yeah.
Is there this kind of latent demand for these tools that leaders are attracted to that they, need to be given? Is there this kind of political will component that's really important? I don't know.
Yeah. So an important detail I left out was this actually replaced something else. So they were already supposed to go in a classroom, and it was very, it was very little about what was actually happening in the classroom at that time. It was much more about, are students behaving? Are they following the curriculum correctly? Like, it really wasn't about what was happening in the classroom. And then the circuit supervisors had a form, and their previous form had been something like, are you observing the workbooks or the little student exercise books have been completed? And we heard from teachers that they would know when their circuit supervisor was coming. And so they would have their students copy all these exercises off the board in the 2 days before the circuit supervisor came. So then the circuit supervisor comes and says, oh, yes, look, all of these books have been filled out, right? So I think part of it is we replaced a form that was there with maybe some not as meaningful outcomes with more meaningful outcomes. And then this is part of how teachers are evaluated. I mean, there's a very weak incentive structure, and there's almost no penalty if you don't do well. But these forms are then collected, and the data is supposed to go to the district education office. So we basically embedded this in something that they were already supposed to be doing.
Got it. Okay. So if you could you started talking about this a little bit at the end of your last answer, but what do you think are the kind of the next set of research questions that you'd be interested in, particularly in this space of school leadership?
Yeah.
And as school leadership kind of impacts student outcomes.
Sure. I think this is wide open. I think we know almost nothing. So I think anything we can answer in this space is really, really useful. So I think we know quite a bit from just the relationship studies that say schools with better kind of management have better student outcomes.
Right.
But I think we know very little both how to move that management and the most important pieces of that management for increasing student outcomes. And kind of to give you an idea of kind of how little we know, there's a recent meta-analysis that came out that looked at studies in Africa since 2014. And of all the studies in Africa, focused on improving student learning, only 3% even touched on school management. And so I think kind of we would both agree that the school leader is a fundamentally really important person in thinking about improving student, say about how to do that. And then kind of the fantasy worlds, at some point we figure out what is the most effective, what is the most cost effective. But I think we're pretty far from saying those mosts. I think we're just trying to think about, how can we improve school leadership that improves student outcomes.
Got it. Okay. Great. Well, this was a really interesting conversation. Thanks for taking the time
Yeah,
to
sure.
have
Happy to do it.
All right. Thank you.